Hello and welcome to this video on herbal remedies. This is the wider term that covers everything from that weight loss pill that is sold on late night television to the obscure traditional Chinese medicine that an old man tries to sell you in a dark alleyway. It is a wide subject, but thankfully much of it falls into two categories. Those remedies with a known function and those with a claimed function. The distinction relies on the evidence to support use. For example, rhinoceros horn for erectile dysfunction has no evidence, and so is a claimed function. Conversely, evening primrose is supposed to help with low iron levels, and has some evidence for use, so falls into a known function. A lot of the advertising for both of these relies on traditional uses. That is, has some group or region used it for a given purpose, historically. This is of course a flawed approach, as bloodletting, mercury, arsenic, and more were all used at various times and in various places for traditional reasons, but none are good for you. For this video, we are going to look at a series of examples of herbal remedies with both known and claimed functions, how those claims compare to reality, and what the purported function is based on. To find suitable examples, we looked across multiple websites claiming the best herbal remedies available, either in your yard or from a commercial source. One noteworthy consideration that needs stating before going into any depth on any example is the relationship between the amount of a herb in a given remedy and the amount of its active ingredient or ingredients. Unfortunately, there isn't. This is why most prescription medications give the amount of its active ingredient, not the total amount of a given pill, milliliter, and so on. The reason for this is that concentrations of any active ingredient can vary considerably between samples, time of year when harvested, and even how much of the herb and different parts of the herb are used. This is why how much of a herb is used is less useful than knowing how much of the active ingredient is meant to be present based on testing. Because of general market practices, it often leads to so many milligrams, micrograms, or grams of such and such a herb in a dried or equivalent state being listed as the active ingredient. But this is not the active ingredient. This is the raw, relatively unrefined product, and you don't actually know how much you're getting in this. The same problem has persisted into research into these herbal remedies, as some do not provide concentrations of either the herb or the active ingredients that they claim are responsible for the observed outcomes. The reason this is so important is that anything can have an effect if you use enough of it. The first example we're going to look at is turmeric. It consists of a rhizome, which is essentially just a large root underground which is dried and powdered. This is how you often find it, a somewhat orangey, brownish, and sometimes red coloured powder. It's rich in two products, curcuminoids and curcumin. Of the two, curcumin is considered the more important active ingredient. Despite that, the two are somewhat inseparable, so looking at them, you would have to consider both active ingredients. A meta-analysis of curcumin has found that it does have a negative effect on oxidative stress. That is, it reduces it. This is indicative of a beneficial effect. Most oxidative stress leads to other effects that aren't wanted, things like plaques in arteries. They were looking at this in terms of the serum concentration of various products, mostly lipid peroxide, but also glutathione products. These are proxy measures of its effect, and obviously there's no long-term follow-up if you're simply looking at a cause and effect relationship. The other noteworthy part of this particular review was that all of the analyses were done with products that had been specifically modified to increase bioavailability. That is, they had to find a way to make it able to pass from your GI tract and into the bloodstream more effectively. 4 out of 6 of the analyses they conducted used something called piperine. This in turn has created another confounding variable, especially if the herbal remedy that you're using doesn't contain this as well, as you're not going to get anywhere near the same effect with reduced bioavailability. Its method of action is fairly straightforward by comparison to many others. It scavenges free radicals from the environment around it, primarily looking at things like oxygen and nitrogen species. By doing this, you do remove one way that the body can undergo negative effects from it. It is effectively just a potent antioxidant, something you might get as much benefit from drinking a glass of wine, eating a punnet of berries, or otherwise having a healthy diet. One thing it does do that these don't is to inhibit some of the ROS-generating enzymes, ROS being reactive oxygen species. Trials of turmeric with healthy individuals, and focusing specifically on curcumin, have found that it does have downsides. Those who received between 500 and 12,000 mg doses and followed for 3 days had diarrhea, headaches, rash, and yellow stool. The last is not that surprising given the coloration of what's being consumed. Another study found that being given between 0.45 and 3.6 grams a day of curcumin for between 1 and 4 months led to nausea, diarrhea, and an increase in serum alkaline phosphatases and lactate dehydrogenases. These again are relatively high doses as well, so this is one of the things that is worth being aware of from the very first example. The amount that you are taking could be significantly more than is beneficial. And as with all things, the dose makes the poison. A small amount of something may be beneficial, a little more may be better for you, and a lot more could be very bad for you. Next is chamomile, and this is a herbal remedy often said to help with sleep and insomnia. It is unfortunately a very complicated product, primarily because the flower itself has many different parts in it. The bioactive substances that are most important are the volatile oils. There is between 0.24 and 1.9% volatile oils by mass. When you try and figure out which of these oils in particular, there are terpenoids, particularly the alpha-bisabol and its oxide azelines. There's also 2 more called camozoline and acetylene derivatives. Those 4 in total are the major active ingredients. Those 4 ingredients are what's going to have its effects when it comes to sleep and insomnia. It is also said to have strong antioxidant effects. The reality is that, as with most similar sorts of herbal remedies, there's very little evidence to support it. Long term, chamomile appears to be relatively safe and does reduce some of the symptoms, particularly regarding insomnia, but it doesn't reduce the rate of relapse back into insomnia. So this is much like putting a band-aid over a bullet wound. You will have a temporary and possibly effective solution, but it won't fix the issue, and once you stop drinking it regularly, you will go back to having insomnia or other sleep issues. This is true of other herbal remedies that were studied in the same general category, such as valerian and kava. Another noteworthy example is evening primrose, and this is another interesting example primarily because we're looking at the flower being used. The active ingredient is, however, far more easily identified. It's the gamma-linolenic acid, or GLA. There are also linear aliphatic alcohols and phenolic compounds. All of these are present as an oil within evening primrose. It's claimed to have protective effects against pro-inflammatory markers. These would be your factors related to things like stress, so for example, oxidative compounds. Evening primrose does show some modulating effect on the tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-1 beta, and thromboxane B2. This reduces the COX-2 gene expression, which is a gene involved in inflammation, so it may reduce that effect. It's also shown to have some effect, although this is comparing it to a placebo, in reducing the frequency and severity of coughing symptoms. These are very tenuous claims and based on very limited evidence. And so, although you could say it does lack evidence that it fails to work, it would be more appropriate to say that it doesn't have evidence of its efficacy. Another common example is Comfrey. It's a medicinal herb and it's used by taking the roots or rhizomes from the plant. These are dried and powdered. What you extract from it is something called rosmarinic acid. This is also said to have anti-inflammatory properties. Testing has been limited across the board, as most companies will rely on the traditional use argument rather than a clinical argument. Despite this, there is an upper limit in some countries on how much of it can be consumed over a given period, and this is because it contains pyrrolidazine alkaloids. When ingesting Comfrey, it can lead to hepatotoxicity or liver toxicity and therefore have very adverse effects on your health. Oral preparations can also lead to cancer. Unlike some of the other listed items, this is something that should never be consumed orally and shouldn't be used on open wounds. This is one of the situations where having it available as a herbal remedy isn't necessarily good because it can easily cause severe complications. It is not the only example. Licorice is another. Licorice is similar to some of the other mentioned species that we've spoken about, in terms of it being a root. The root is dried and then used. Unlike most of the others that we've mentioned, there are several different species that make it up. In fact, there are 3 primary species which come under the umbrella of licorice. Only one of them is really used as frequently, and that is the Urulenus fish variety. For the most part, between them you won't find much of importance, but there is differences in the morphological characteristics, particularly the root, rhizome, seed, fruit, and the leaf and stem height. As far as the active ingredients and the flavoring compound in particular, it's all the same. That is glycyrrhizin. This is the main active component of licorice and what is responsible for most of its functionality. If you give different doses to rats, there seem to be no immediate harm from 500 to 2000 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Long-term effects, on the other hand, are somewhat different. When you're consuming less than 100 micrograms a day, there appears to be no adverse harm. Above this, and for a long time, there is, and that's because it has a glycocorticosteroid-like action. This can have an effect on the central nervous system. Noteworthy here is the effect it has on cardiovascular patients, where it can cause arrhythmias and other heart irregularities, and those who are psychological patients where it can have severe mental effects on them. Another effect of this is that it can produce some of these same effects as corticoids, or corticoid steroids in humans. Particularly, it has the effect of a hypermineralocorticoid. This, by virtue of blocking an enzyme, can cause the increase in activity of cortisol to start with, and this increases the amount of sodium and a decrease in potassium. This has varying effects on the cardiovascular system, blood volume, and platelets via the cortisol activity. There's also inactivation of cortisone, and this can decrease the iron content in the liver, cause liver toxicity, erectile dysfunction, and a few other complications. All of that comes from the way that the glycyrrhizin can either replicate, interact with, or otherwise modulate different hormones in the body at higher doses. Yohimbe is another, and it's often marketed as an aphrodisiac and male sexual performance enhancer. Given that this is an off-label use, and it's certainly not Viagra, you can imagine that it's going to have some interesting activity. It's originally produced by taking the bark of the Yohimbe tree and drying it and using it much like many others. This leads to the relative isolation and concentration of an alkaloid monoamine oxidase inhibitor. This blocks adrenergic receptors. If you've ever had reason to look into antidepressants and antipsychotics, you may know that MAOIs, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, are used particularly because they help with the brain. The downside to these is that the way they interact with the brain means that they also have a propensity to interact with other chemicals. When used by themselves and in isolation from everything else, it can increase dilation of blood vessels and lower blood pressure. This isn't particularly bad, and it's one reason why it can be used as an aid for sex. It can cause enlargement of blood vessels, particularly in the penis. This causes an erection. This, in conjunction with other things, can then in turn elevate mood, which, given the use of MAOIs as antidepressants, isn't that surprising. The problem with Yohimbe is that it can have some pretty nasty side effects. High blood pressure is perhaps the least of these. In fact, it's the same sort of worry that you have with Viagra. It can also cause anxiety, an increase in heart rate, and headaches. If you are foolish enough to try and buy nearly pure Yohimbe, it can cause heart failure and death. And this again comes back to the increases in blood pressure. We mentioned earlier the complications of taking MAOIs. They interact readily with a variety of different things. There is the, let's say, nefarious example from Hannibal Lecter, where he is said to have eaten the liver of a census taker with a nice Chianti and some fava beans. The problem with this is that those fava beans would have contained chemicals in them that would interact with the MAOIs he was likely on, and this could have caused his death. The same way that tranquilizers, antidepressants, blood pressure medications, and more can all have similar and likely just as life-threatening consequences. It can have some serious effects if you are pregnant and cause early pregnancy or spontaneous abortion. Kidney diseases are another concern, along with heart disease, liver disease, and diabetes, all of which are exacerbated by the changes in blood pressure from Yohimbe. There's also the issue of psychiatric illnesses if you are taking this as a supplement. This is not a herbal remedy that anybody with psychiatric illnesses should consider, given the way it plays with the human brain, particularly those who have psychoses. The final example is cinnamon, and cinnamon is one that you may not have even considered, yet some people think it's a great idea to try and push the envelope. Taking 12 milligrams of coumarin, the active ingredient in cinnamon, can lead to a significant amount that is not actually absorbed, somewhere around 33 to nearly 40%. The exact amount that is absorbed will vary by formulation, but the effects are the same. We've already previously described in another video on Fireball whiskey why cinnamon in particular can be bad if you consume enough of it, and it all comes down to the way it can play havoc with your liver. It can cause hepatotoxicity, and from that you get a whole series of other complications regarding blood pressure, blood volume, proteins in the blood, production of glucose, absorption of glucose, and so on. These examples are just that, examples, and they highlight some of the issues to do with herbal remedies. The fact is, they are largely under-evidenced for what they're supposed to do. This is one of the big reasons why very few, if any of them, are sold as anything but a supplement. None of them are sold readily as a prescription-type product. That is, exactly how much of it you're getting and exactly what it's meant to do. They're all often sold under the umbrella of being a traditional use or something similar. They can avoid much of the scrutiny that any other medication would need to go under because of that. At the same time, you also don't know what you're getting to the same degree that anybody else would if they were buying something that had been tested, quantified, and measured. This can mean that a herbal remedy could be everything from the completely wrong product, a completely different plant, or so much of the intended product that you could be overdosing on it quite readily. That is all before you even get to the point where you are looking at whether or not it's going to have the intended effect that you want. Whether that is to solve erectile dysfunction, to help you get to sleep, or to just help you improve your quality of life through reducing inflammation and adding some color and flavor to food. All of these are by themselves indicative of something that they might be doing, but nothing more than you would get from an otherwise healthy lifestyle, a moderate amount of food intake, and not going to any extremes with any one particular product in pursuit of a better life. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.